So I wanted to start by asking the audience, how many of you have some idea of what toil is? Oh, wow. Okay. How many of you are familiar with Sisyphus? Oh, nice. Okay, so you're well classically educated. Sisyphus, for those of you who don't know, was the guy who was sentenced forever in Hades to roll a rock, a very large rock, up a hill and never be able to reach the top. So toil is in some ways like that. It is manual work that is done repetitively, that could be automated, but hasn't been yet. It's tactical. So that means that it's devoid of long-term value. It deals with the problem in the moment. And unfortunately, when you're on call, a lot of the time, what you do to mitigate problems ends up being tactical because honestly, you've got another alert that's going to come and bother you. And if you can just live through the next 3 days or 24 hours or whatever your on-call duration is, well, the next person will have to deal with it instead. And the key point about toil is that it grows with your service growth. And Jamie pointed out this morning that if it's a sublinear growth, then it may be tolerable up to a certain capacity level. But if it's growing linearly with your growth, and let's hope your service is growing, whether it's users or requests or dollars or whatever, if your toil is growing linearly or superlinearly, it's not going to be sustainable. So sustainable engineering is important because you've got people, you don't want to fry them, you don't want to get fried yourself, and you just can't afford to burn people. So the genesis for our work at LinkedIn on this came from a talk that was given at Velocity in 2014 by a couple of gentlemen from, at that time, Etsy. I don't believe either of them are there any longer. But they did this talk called Mean Time to Sleep. And yes, they were dressed as sort of astronauts because they were delving into the human aspects of how often are people woken up from sleep in order to respond to incidents at Etsy. Etsy built a tool, and as Etsy typically does, they open sourced it for people who would care to use their technology. It's there at the bottom. By the way, these slides are already posted on the LISA program site, so you can get those if you missed the link at the beginning. It comes back at the end. So what we did at LinkedIn is that we started by trying to establish a baseline. If you're going to try to do work and you want to make sure that your work is meaningful and effective, you want to measure it. That's sort of a principle of SRE. So we started by dividing time up into a number of categories. First one was toil. We used the term reactive because of some individual managers who had an aversion to the term toil at the time. Since then, they've overcome it as toil has become a more accepted term in the industry. So one category was toil, or reactive work. Second category we're asking people to characterize their work as is overhead. So how much time do you spend going to your team stand-ups, or interviewing candidates, or filling out peer feedback? Things like that. It's just the normal everyday overhead of being part of an organization. It may feel toilsome, but it can't be automated. And then there's software engineering, writing or maintaining code, documents that are associated with that code, other artifacts related to code, and systems engineering and architecture, which is sort of larger scale design, reviews, and frankly, writing designs. We separate design writing from code documentation writing, partly because they live in different places. And the last category we ask people to identify is how much time they take on vacation. We call it DTO, and we didn't think that vacation time should count against the fraction of the other time, but you'd be surprised how many managers think that if they have 2 engineers on their team, and there's 13 weeks in a quarter, that they have 26 weeks of work that they can get out of them in a quarter. When you measure vacation and people report on their vacation, it helps educate those managers that no, you can't get 26 weeks of work out of 2 people in a quarter. So we tried to make recording and tracking toil not toilsome in itself. We didn't want to perturb the environment any more than we needed to, so we came up with a very simple survey that I'll show you shortly. It took, on average, less than 3 minutes for people to complete. We asked them to do this every month, at the end of the month, in very gross categories, so that we could have an overall picture of where we stood. We had a few demographics that we were asking people for. I'm not going to read through all of these details because it's all in the slides, and you can pull the slides up and use as you wish after this. But essentially, we wanted to know what part of the organization they were in, whether they're manager or an IC. We gave them the definitions. These definitions are taken largely verbatim from the SRE book. This is the definition for toil with a little bit of extra information added to specify that if they were on call for a week, then they should classify that week as being reactive. So this was the crux of the survey, is this grid. It didn't have any fancy logic that prevented people from recording more than 100% of their time. We did not have many people who did record more than 100% of their time. But it asked them in 10% increments approximately over the course of the last month, how much time did you spend in each of these categories? Once people got used to it, they could fill it out pretty quickly, and the complaints went down after they had seen it the first time and came back the second month, and it worked out pretty well. Is it perfect? No. But having something is so much better than having nothing. And here's how our results turned out. It turned out that about 21% of people's time was spent on overhead. We had 42% of the time was spent in engineering purposes. This project was kicked off as what we called the 50-50 project. We wanted 50% of people's time to be spent in engineering and then 50% on other stuff. We didn't quite come out that well. We ended up with 37% reactive, and by the time you had the overhead in, we didn't quite get to 50%, but we weren't as bad as we were afraid we were going to be. We did have some teams that were worse than others in terms of their reactive to engineering balance. But the comments we got were the most instructive. These are a sampling of some of the comments, aside from the snarky ones, that we got. A lot of them saying, hey, on-call really hurts. On-call is obnoxious. On-call is not well staffed. Or tools that we have to use in order to get our job done suck, more or less. They have problems. We're not getting them fixed. We're not getting attention from our engineering services team or whatever your comparable team might be called in your organization. They're not listening to us, and our job is terrible because of it. So I'm going to take an interlude from our intentional work that we discovered in talking to some of the managers that some of the teams had been implementing their engineering work through agile principles and trying to assign essentially story points to the work, the SRE work that they were wanting to do, the engineering projects. Talking to managers who had been successful with this and unsuccessful, we found the successful ones had done things like story points were the equivalent of a half a day's work. Trying to categorize things into finer granularity was just a waste of time. And we discovered that teams could essentially infer their level of interruption by their inability to make progress as planned on their agile velocity. So manual, repetitive work that was coming up and exerting a drag on the team's forward velocity. Again, things that could have been automated but weren't. things that were short-term. I've just got to do this for the next month because this special report for a manager isn't worth building an automation for. And again, the key here, without enduring value and growing with service growth. So service growth can have some indirect effects. More managers want more reports, therefore you end up spending more time dealing with reports than you would if the service was smaller and you had fewer managers. So phase 2 was to take the findings that we had initially as a baseline and deep dive into aspects that were causing the most pain during on-call, because it was clear that on-call reactive work, dealing with interrupts from engineers and systems, were the big problems. So we did a more in-depth survey around the most disaffected teams. We wanted to identify in depth what the problem areas were and come up with ways to address it. In our case, we ran this survey twice, in the spring and the fall of last year. We did some interventions in between to try to see which interventions were effective. In this case, I will warn you that there are walls of text coming that I am going to just skip through because you have the content available in the slides you can download. But each of the questions on the following walls of text were scored on a 1 to 5 basis, from not a problem to, oh my God, kill me now, or doesn't apply to my team. And then we took and analyzed all the results. So, warning, walls of text here that I'm going to fly through. So here's how it all came out. This is an abbreviated grid of the results, most painful in red at the top, sorted to the top, and I truncated the bottom part because it was below where we could take effective intervention. Essentially, we came up with 3 main areas that were affecting people's on-call to the detriment thereof. Downstream issues was number 1. So if you have a member-facing service, in our case we have members who don't pay us and we have customers who do. A lot of my work is around the member side of LinkedIn. So if you were going to view your profile and it wasn't displaying your profile because something in the data store was broken, that would be a downstream issue, but it would probably manifest because the profile service reported the problem. That was our number 1 complaint as far as why on-call is painful. I get woken up, but I can't do anything about it. I just have to call another team. Managing alerts was the second, and it covered a whole bunch of the areas of the questions here. We grouped essentially these areas in red into, this had to do with managing alerts. Alerts that were not tuned well, alerts that were noisy, again, alerts that were not meaningful. They were put in once upon a time and maybe bit rot has gotten to them and they're no longer useful. And in general, interruptions. This could be interruptions from alerts, it could be interruptions from other engineers walking up and asking questions or needing work done. Some of the on-call teams have gone to the point of having 2 different on-call people. The first on-call person deals with alerts from the system, and the second person deals with interruptions from other engineering teams so that the rest of the team can focus on engineering work and not be interrupted. It's a mitigation for the issue. Some teams find that it works really well, but it's certainly not optimal. So those were the 3 main areas that we found that people were complaining about, having the worst time and experience with, and that's where we exerted our efforts. I did want to show you, this is kind of an overall characterization of the results from the survey. So the survey had a ton of issues. You can see that there's variations from team to team, but there's some teams over here that in general are not feeling too bad about their on-call. And then there's other teams that are just dying. So don't think that this is a uniform experience. As Jamie commented this morning in his talk, things are not evenly distributed. Pain is not evenly distributed. effective practices are not evenly distributed, and frankly, broken services are not evenly distributed. So we had a number of interventions that we wanted to undertake. Some of them were tooling to help us better understand what's going on. Some of them were just management strategies that we had. So to deal with downstream alerts, we have a tool called Linked Out. It's part of our WaterBear package, and there's been some blog posts and other talks about WaterBear. Essentially, it allows a chaos engineering type approach so that we empower the feature developers to say, what happens to my service if I don't get a response from this downstream? And they can do this on a selective basis and evaluate the effects on their service of not getting a response or not getting a timely response from a downstream. Alert correlation is an attempt to take the alert storms that would often occur when a data store goes out and 32 other microservices failed because that data store is not answering them. All of a sudden, you've got 100 alerts that should be clumped into one. On-call retrospective is a tool to help, and I'll talk more about the tooling of on-call retrospective, to help teams do the handoff more effectively and not lose items as they go through handoff. Improving alert notes. The idea here was that an alert should have more information with it so that they don't have to do so much triage, especially at 2 in the morning, to understand what might have to be done in order to fix it. Changing of the on-call scheduling, we have traditionally had 7-day on. Some teams who are fortunate enough to have a counterpart team in our Bangalore office are 7/12, other teams are 7/24. And we found that for the worst affected teams, switching that up so they have either a 3 on, 4 off or a 4 on, 3 off trading cycle allows them to kind of dissipate their trauma more effectively rather than having to deal with it for 7 days in the trenches. They can be under fire for 4 days, and then they've got 3 days to recover before the cycle repeats. And 4 days or 3 days is a much more sustainable, you can see a light at the end of the tunnel, than 7 days for some of these teams. And then making sure that the devs are on call. Initially, we've had SREs that were taking the brunt of the first line work here, and sharing the pain with the devs helps them to understand the effect of their services being unreliable. So our first steps here were to leverage the on-call retro tool, change the on-call scheduling, and so I talked about most of these on the previous slide. And then our second follow-up was to re-administer the survey with the question of, hey, how have things changed since we started this in the spring? Okay, we've been 6 months into it. Have the things that we've done helped your life? Results were mixed. Yes, some things helped. You can see that the worst affected teams here for the on-call scheduling had a significant improvement in their on-call quality of life. But in other cases, things were slightly better, but there was an awful lot of unchanged in general, which was unfortunate, but I mean, we made some steps forward. So let me talk about the tooling that we built. Insomnia, we like to do in-jokes because we're linked in. Insomnia was our take on the mean time to sleep. Essentially, it's a feeding all of our alert information into an Elasticsearch framework, and then allowing people to use the power of Kibana to have all kinds of pretty pictures and graphs. And you'll see a lot of these details are blurred out, but essentially up at the top is kind of a graph of alerts, and they're split by the ones that wake people up based on whatever your working hours are versus the ones that were during your business day. And so that gives a way for a team to get together when they're doing the handoff at the end of the week or the end of the 3 or 4 day period and say, okay, here's the way the last few days have been or the last week. And so you can infer what your next period of on-call might be like. On-call retro is a tool to take all of those alerts, load them into a framework where the on-call engineers can grade them, essentially, saying, was this alert effective? And if not, why was it not effective? So was it downstream? Was it poorly tuned? I already knew about this, and so it was just essentially a repeat. It's a relatively straightforward back-end MySQL database. It's not open sourced, but the idea is to take all of your alerts from whatever your alerting system is, and then let the engineers who had to deal with them comment on them so that you can learn from it and then have something to go back and take action on. We get all kinds of pretty charts and graphs out of it. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on these because what we found is that only about 20% of the alerts were tagged by the engineers. Part of that's because the worst affected teams have a lot of alerts, and adding more work to go in and tag an alert as being good or bad is just not something that people are really excited about. We were able to see, let's see here, sleep interruptions, for example. So you can see we were able to cut down on the amount of interruption of sleep because we can look at the time of day that these things fired off. You can see it by day, by week, by month. Once you got the data in a database, you can do all kinds of fun, mostly not very helpful visualizations. And frankly, the biggest concern about this is the low tagging percentage, so I don't want to belabor this hugely. We still find when people do tag alerts, they're tagging 52% of them as being ineffective. And so that's something that we still need to work on. Unfortunately, we don't know if that 52% we don't know if people are tagging in a sampling effective way or if they're tending to tag stuff that they're annoyed with, for example. So, in recap, Toil, manual, repetitive. You could automate it, but haven't. It's tactical, short-term value, and it grows as your service grows. So will you join the Anti-Toil League? I encourage you to do so. Take steps, measure what's going on amongst your teams. Do something that has at least a consistency to it, because then you can tell if you're making a difference with the work that you do. And here, as promised, is the link to the slides. Questions? And please use the microphone. There's one in the aisle there, Marley.
Yeah, I'd like to know if you are continuing these sort of on-call service improvement or survey process. Are you continuing to do that? Is that going to be part of your normal routine? Or was this kind of just a one-time thing to kind of see where you're at, and now you feel like you have a good grasp on it and you're good to go, or kind of where you're at with that?
Great question. It is a continuing effort, although the amount of attention and thought that's going into it has dropped off a bit. It does have some sort of a baseline sustaining effort, but it isn't a big focus at the moment. So it kind of waxes and wanes as far as the amount of attention that's applied to it.
2 questions. Are you using this to inform like staffing decisions? Like, for example, this SRE team need help, and so let's drop 2 or 3 people in to see if we can help fix the services that they're on call for. And leading on from that, do your dev teams look at these reports, right? Like, do your dev teams look at the Toil pain reports of their SRE teams who are on call for them and go, oh, that release really turned things a bit crappy. Maybe we should have a look at what happened there.
No, they don't. We wish that they would. And as far as informing staffing, it certainly does provide input to kind of team ordering as far as who gets new headcount and things like that. But again, we don't necessarily want to throw people at it because then we could be feeding the monster.
Hi, I was wishing if you could explain a bit more about the on-call rotation itself. You said 12 hours is your shift, so that is off business hours?
Well, there's two approaches. One is that a team that has a counterpart team in Bangalore could be 12 on just during the business day, and then basically Bangalore, which is 12 hours shifted from California, would cover Bangalore business hours, which is nighttime in the U.S. Teams that don't have counterparts in Bangalore end up having to run the 24 hours themselves.
And in the second case, do they, the 3 days, 4 days on, 3 days off, the one that you described, is that actually being done within the team itself? Like, one person is on for 3 days and then the next person is on for 3 days, like that?
Usually what they do in order to not kind of shift across the calendar is that one person will be on for 3, the next person will be on for 4, the next person will be on for 3, and then they try to rotate over who ends up with the 3 and the 4-day shifts.
Thank you.
And we're running short on time. I see Pat
Quick question.
cutting the line off. Please go ahead.
So are your dev operators, empowered to change their own alerts? I mean, that's
Yes.
a high number of
Yes.
ineffective alerts. Okay, that's all.
They are.
Why don't they just
But again,
quit?
there's a certain degree of I'm in the trenches. I'm very tunnel focused on responding right now, and oftentimes as soon as people get out of the rotation,
Gotcha.
they forget all the pain they suppress all the pain of the rotation, and so they don't necessarily effectively go back and address the alerts that were plaguing them the worst.
Thanks.
Let's all give a round of applause to Kurt Anderson.
Thank you.